When I was young and watched the Titanic for the first time, I bawled my eyes out at the scene where Jack and Rose said their final goodbyes watching the ship sink. I cried especially hard that night because I knew that if Jack had let Rose simply fit him onto the board, he would have survived. But years later, rethinking the Titanic, like many of you, I still think of it as beautiful. I think of its grandeur and the romantic story of the two lovers. What we all ignore, however, is a facade of uncontrollable luck. Perhaps it seems that every passenger's life and death depended on how fast they got out of their rooms or how well they adapted to the situation. But as Professor Xue, an economist from China, pointed out, the Titanic was structured to control luck. First-class passengers were closer to the exit, lived in higher rooms, better equipped with life jackets. Safety was technically associated with your ticket price. But that's not the point of this story. Think about it. If a rich businessman and a little boy showed up on the deck at the same time, would any crewman have said, let's check their net worth, measure what class they're in, to decide who we should save first? The answer is obviously no. They made decisions with one of their most basic human instincts, sympathy. Human sympathy can be so powerful to the point where when we're close enough to each other to see each other suffering, that sympathy transcends any political or financial boundary. In our current age of technology, information transfers faster than ever. We've witnessed many more stories of success and also many more about suffering. We should be forming more emotional connections with each other, like how that little boy and that crewman could have done on the Titanic. There should be less political gridlock, less racism, less apathy, because we seem to stand closer to each other than we ever have before. But the truth is, most of us have lost that ability. We've become desensitized, numb to others' pain because of so many factors that you've already heard of. But as a high school student who has tried so hard to avoid complete desensitization, I've come to the surprising conclusion that the culprit isn't just us, the consumers. It's the school system. Being aware is good, and all of us are trying to do that. But schools and extracurriculars force us to do it in a few detrimental ways. Firstly, through analysis. Whether it be through research projects or social science classes, we are forced to dissect news into causes, effects, logic chains. And as a result, news becomes cold and academic. We often forget that millions of people actually suffer from headline occurrences. Second, mass consumption. Perhaps it is unavoidable that in our current stage of life as students, we must explore a variety of topics because we still haven't decided on which part of the world we want to focus on or what field we want to study in. So, inevitably, schools tell us to explore a variety of all sorts of fields. We have one speaker or one assembly about one topic before we move on to the next. We go through these topics like we scroll through Instagram reels. A never-ending supply of media, and an ever-lacking scarcity of attention. But finally, and perhaps the most interesting cause behind this all, is that there is deadline after deadline. And these deadlines do more than keep us up at night, wondering if our submission at 11:59 went through before midnight. Instead, they also shorten our attention span. We focus on one thing at a time, and after an assignment ends, it's thrown to the back of your head until you receive a grade. These deadlines don't just exist for school activities. For example, I compete in extemporaneous speaking, which is a speech event where I use 30 minutes of preparation time to create a 7-minute-long speech about current events, upon which I sprinkle all sorts of evidence from all sorts of news sources. Competition guidelines like this force competitors to merely glance over devastating pieces of statistics before they have to try to recite the publication dates of articles. For our country's 140,000 speech and debate competitors, as well as so many more students, it's hard to find and stick to a passion. So, discussion no longer creates actual change. We know the problem, but we don't try to solve it. We think, but we don't feel. We speak, but we're not alive. Don't let all that discourage you. As the problems become much clearer than before, the solutions also appear. Perhaps the first one, and the most important, yet the hardest to do, is to fuel your emotional connections. The story of 3-year-old little Leanne, as pictured, who traveled across so many borders in Europe as a refugee seeking sanctuary, isn't just another rhetorical introduction for your debate speech. Her story is powerful because it's supposed to make us feel something. So, before you move past the awards and the trophies and that debate round or that school research paper, stay with the pieces of evidence that you find. Treat at least one person like a friend, not like a number. Second, knowing isn't enough. The reason why a lot of us are desensitized in the first place is that the standard for being a good global citizen hasn't caught up with society's footsteps. News has become cheaper and more available, and yet we still consider being aware as adequate. It's time to raise that bar, because as cliche as it sounds, more resources also means heavier responsibilities. Saying his name isn't enough. Telling his story again and again and again is the next step. Finally, when you're ready to act, don't let schools and news sources convince you that the only legitimate form of change is large-scale global change. The reason why national news sources like New York Times don't report local stories is because those don't generate enough views and not enough revenue. Similarly, Milton Academy, like other schools, don't teach us about local issues as much as national or global ones, because somewhere, somehow, each of us managed to convince each other that we're global before we are local, that we look at the world from a vast and grand perspective. But we are better equipped to change issues when we're much closer to them. Look into your local neighborhood, research your community, interview the people around you, because those are the issues that you know best, and those are the issues that you can actually change. Schools inevitably tell us to zoom out, to analyze reports, to think. But let's zoom in. Let's focus on every single connection that you've made, whether it be with the people around you or with the people that you see in those news guidelines. This talk can only last for a few minutes, but those connections that you make should last for much longer than when you're just reading that headline itself. They should last as long as that piece of news stays in your mind. Thank you.